The silence of 1 in the morning has a specific weight to it. It's the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I was sitting in my old armchair, the only light in the house coming from a dim floor lamp and the soft glow of a book I wasn't really reading. My mind was drifting, thinking about the mundane things of tomorrow, until the sound shattered everything. It wasn't a knock. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, the sound of someone trying to outrun a ghost. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rushed to the foyer. When I swung the door open, the cold night air wasn't the only thing that rushed in. It was my daughter, Sarah. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She simply collapsed forward, her weight sinking into my chest as if her bones had suddenly turned to glass. I caught her, pulling her into the warmth of the hallway, and that's when the light hit her face. My breath hitched in my throat. Her lip was split, a dark, jagged line of red against her pale skin, and her left eye was already beginning to swell into a deep, angry purple. "Sarah? Oh God, Sarah, what happened?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and a rising, white-hot protective rage. She was shaking so violently, I thought she might break apart in my arms. I led her to the kitchen, my hands shaking just as badly as hers. As I pulled a chair out for her, I noticed the sleeve of her coat was torn, and there were faint, dark fingerprints bruised into the skin of her wrists, the unmistakable marks of being held down. This wasn't a car accident. This wasn't a fall. This was him, Mark, the man I had shaken hands with at the altar, the man I had trusted to cherish her. As I pressed a cold cloth to her face, the story started to leak out in jagged, painful shards. It started with a phone, a notification that popped up on his screen while he was in the shower, a name she didn't recognize followed by a heart emoji. It was the cliché of every failing marriage, the smoking gun of a betrayal Sarah had suspected but didn't want to believe. When he stepped out, steam still rolling off his shoulders, she asked him, just a simple question. A question any wife has the right to ask. But Mark didn't offer an apology. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, the man she thought she knew vanished, replaced by a stranger with eyes like flint. He had laughed at first, a cold, mocking sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. He told her she was crazy, that she was suffocating him, and that if she was going to go looking for problems, she was finally going to find one. The argument had escalated with the speed of a wildfire. Sarah tried to walk away, to go to the bedroom and lock the door, but he had reached out and grabbed her. That was the moment the line was crossed. The verbal venom turned into physical force. He didn't just want to hide his affair anymore. He wanted to punish her for discovering it. As she sat at my kitchen table, flinching every time I moved the cloth, I realized I wasn't just looking at my daughter. I was looking at a survivor who had barely escaped a house that had become a prison. The man I once called a son-in-law had become a monster under the cover of darkness, and as the clock ticked toward 2 a.m., I knew that our lives had changed forever. There would be no going back. There would be no forgiveness. There would only be the long, hard road of what came next. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the flicker of shame in her eyes. It broke my heart more than the bruises did. She felt like she had failed, like she was the one who should be embarrassed for being broken. I took her hand, squeezing it firmly so she would look at me. I told her, without a doubt in my soul, that the shame did not belong to her. It belonged to the man who thought he could lay a hand on her and get away with it. But as the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity, I realized Mark wouldn't just let her go. A man who uses violence to control is a man who doesn't like losing his grip. We were safe for the moment, but the night was far from over. The kettle whistled on the stove, a sharp, piercing sound that made Sarah jump nearly out of her skin. I rushed to turn it off, the silence that followed feeling even heavier than before. I made her a cup of tea, something warm for her shaking hands to hold, even though I knew it wouldn't fix the coldness settled in her bones. She began to speak again, her voice a low, hollow rasp. She told me that the incident tonight wasn't just a sudden explosion. It was the final collapse of a structure that had been rotting for months. She had noticed the changes early on, the way he started taking his phone into every room, the way he would suddenly work late on Tuesday nights but come home smelling of expensive cologne and expensive gin. At first, she tried to convince herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that the stress of his new promotion was making him distant, that she was just projecting her own insecurities onto a man who loved her. But the gut never lies. The gut knows when a person's soul has moved out of the house long before their body does. She described the gaslighting, a word she used with a bitter, trembling laugh. Every time she brought up a strange credit card charge or a deleted text thread, he would turn it back on her. He told her she was losing her mind. He told her she was unstable, and that her jealousy was the very thing driving him away. It's a special kind of cruelty, to break someone's heart and then tell them they are the ones holding the hammer. Sarah had started to believe him. She had started to wonder if she really was the problem. She had spent months walking on eggshells, trying to be the perfect, quiet, accommodating wife, just to prove to him and to herself that she deserved his loyalty. But while she was busy trying to save their marriage, Mark was busy building a separate life with a woman half her age, a colleague who didn't have the baggage of a decade of shared history. The violence of the night had been triggered when Sarah finally found the evidence she couldn't ignore. She had found a receipt in his coat pocket for a jewelry store, a necklace she had never seen, purchased on their anniversary. When she confronted him, holding that small, crumpled piece of paper like a weapon, the mask finally slipped. The man she married, the man who had promised to protect her, disappeared entirely. He didn't deny it this time. He didn't make excuses. He told her he was tired of hiding it, and he was tired of her pathetic attempts to keep him. When she tried to grab her keys to leave, he blocked the door. He told her she wasn't going anywhere until she learned how to respect him. That's when the first blow landed. It wasn't just a hand hitting skin. It was the sound of 1,000 promises shattering at once. As I sat there listening, I felt a darkness growing in my own chest. As a father, you spend your whole life trying to keep the world from hurting your children. You teach them to look both ways before crossing the street. You hold their hand through feverish nights. You chase away the monsters under the bed. But nothing prepares you for the moment the monster is the man you gave your blessing to. I looked at the bruises on her wrists again, the purple blooming like dark flowers. My mind began to race. Mark knew she was here. He knew my address. He knew that I was the only person Sarah would run to, and if he was bold enough to strike her in their own home, he was dangerous enough to follow her here. I stood up and walked to the front door, sliding the deadbolt into place and checking the windows. The street outside was dark and empty, but the shadows felt longer than they should. Sarah watched me, her eyes wide and filled with a terrifying mix of exhaustion and fear. She asked me if we should call the police, but her voice was hesitant. There's a specific kind of fear that victims have, the fear that the system won't help, or worse, that calling for help will only make the monster angrier. I told her we weren't going to do anything until she felt safe, but in my mind, I was already preparing for a war. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about survival. I realized then that Mark hadn't just attacked my daughter. He had declared war on our entire family. He thought he could break her, and that she would just crawl away and hide. He didn't realize that she was coming home to a house that would never let her fall again. But even as I felt that surge of protective strength, a small, cold voice in the back of my head whispered a warning. He's not finished yet. The house felt smaller now, the walls closing in as the clock struck 3 in the morning. Sarah had finally stopped shaking, but she had entered a state of catatonic stillness that was almost more frightening. She sat at the table, her tea untouched and stone cold, staring at a spot on the wall as if she could see the future written there. I wanted to tell her it was over, that she was safe now, but the air in the room felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind against the siding made us both flinch. I found myself pacing the length of the kitchen, my mind looping through every interaction I had ever had with Mark. I looked for the signs I must have missed, the flashes of temper, the subtle put-downs, the way he would sometimes grip her arm just a little too tight in public. It was all there, hidden in plain sight, masked by his expensive suits and his practiced, charming smile. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I had let a predator sit at my dinner table for 5 years. Suddenly, a pair of headlights swept across the living room curtains, cutting through the dark like twin blades. My heart stopped. We froze, the only sound in the room being the low hum of the refrigerator. The lights didn't pass by. They slowed down, then died out right in front of the house. Sarah's breath hitched, a tiny, wounded sound escaping her throat. She looked at me, her eyes screaming the name she couldn't bring herself to say. I didn't need her to say it. I knew. I walked to the window, peeling back the edge of the curtain just enough to see out. A black SUV was idling at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl in the stillness of the night. The door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. Even in the dim glow of the street lamp, I recognized the silhouette. It was Mark. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't staggering like a man filled with regret. He walked toward the house with a slow, deliberate confidence that made my blood run cold. He didn't go to the front door at first. He stood at the edge of the lawn, looking up at the house, his face obscured by the shadows. It was a psychological game, a way of letting us know that he was there, that he wasn't afraid, and that he believed he still had authority over what happened inside these walls. I turned back to Sarah and whispered for her to go into the back bedroom and lock the door. She hesitated, her hand reaching out for mine, her knuckles white. I promised her I wouldn't let him in, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew what he was capable of now, and she didn't want my blood on his hands too. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she stood up and retreated into the hallway, the sound of the bedroom door clicking shut echoing through the house. Now it was just me and the man who had broken my daughter. The heavy thud of a boot landed on the porch steps. Then another. Then the doorbell rang, a long, sustained chime that felt like a physical blow. I didn't answer. I stood in the middle of the living room, the shadows wrapping around me, waiting. When the bell didn't work, he started to knock. It wasn't the frantic pounding Sarah had arrived with. It was a rhythmic, steady beat. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a man who thought he was coming to collect his property. "Arthur!" his voice called out from behind the wood. It was calm, chillingly polite. "Arthur, I know she's in there. I just want to talk to her. We had a misunderstanding. You know how she gets. She's being dramatic. Let me in so we can go home and put this to bed." The sheer audacity of his words, the way he tried to paint Sarah as the one at fault even now, ignited a fire in me that I didn't know I still possessed. I walked to the door, but I didn't open it. I spoke through the wood, my voice low and vibrating with a lethal clarity. I told him that if he didn't turn around and get back in his car, the next person he talked to would be a police officer. I told him that if he so much as touched the handle of that door, I would consider it a threat to my life. There was a long silence on the other side. For a second, I thought he might actually leave. But then came the laugh. It was a low, guttural sound, devoid of any warmth. "You're an old man, Arthur," he whispered, his voice now right against the crack of the door. "Don't get in the way of things you don't understand. She's my wife. What happens between us is none of your business. Now, open the door before things get ugly for you too." That was the moment I realized that the man outside wasn't just an unfaithful husband or a common bully. He was someone who had completely detached from reality, consumed by a sense of ownership that didn't allow for anyone to stand in his way. I looked at the heavy oak door, the only thing separating my family from a man who had lost his humanity. I realized then that I wasn't just waiting for the morning anymore. I was waiting for a confrontation that had been years in the making. My hand moved toward the phone on the side table, but before I could pick it up, the sound of glass shattering erupted from the back of the house. He hadn't stayed at the front door. He had sent me a distraction while he found another way in. The sound of the breaking glass was like a gunshot in the dead of night. It came from the guest bathroom, the small window at the back that stayed partially hidden by the overgrown ivy. My heart leaped into my throat, a cold, electric shock of adrenaline flooding my system. I didn't think. I moved. I bolted toward the hallway, my mind screaming Sarah's name. She had heard it too. I saw her bedroom door fly open, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't scream. She couldn't. Her breath was coming in short, jagged gasps as she looked toward the back of the house where the sound of heavy boots crunching on glass filled the air. He was inside. The threshold had been crossed, and with it, Any remaining pretense of civility had vanished. "Get back in the room, Sarah! Lock the door!" I hissed, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. I shoved her back toward the bedroom, but she was frozen, her eyes fixed on the shadow moving down the hallway. Mark emerged from the darkness like a ghost made of malice. He was disheveled now, his expensive coat torn, his eyes wide and gleaming with a frantic, unstable light. He didn't look like a successful businessman anymore. He looked like a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable. He held a heavy wrench in his hand, a tool he must have grabbed from his trunk. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to reclaim what he believed was his by force. "I told you, Arthur," he said, his voice dropping to a low, terrifying hum. "I told you not to get in the way. This is between me and my wife. You're making this so much worse than it needs to be." He took a step forward, the wrench swinging slightly at his side. I stood my ground between him and Sarah's door, my hands clenched into fists, feeling every year of my age and every ounce of my fear. I was half a head shorter than him, and 20 years older, but in that moment, I felt a strength that didn't come from muscle. It came from the ancient, primal instinct to protect my cub. I told him to leave, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest, but he only laughed, that same hollow, echoing sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. He moved faster than I expected. He lunged, not for me, but for the door handle. I threw myself into his path, my shoulder colliding with his chest. It was like hitting a wall of stone. He shoved me back with a casual, brutal strength, sending me stumbling into the opposite wall. My head hit the drywall with a sickening thud, and for a second, the world turned into a swirl of gray and white stars. I felt the cold floor against my palms, the smell of dust and old wood filling my senses. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard Sarah finally scream, a high, thin sound that broke my heart. She was begging him to stop, telling him she would go with him if he just left me alone. That was the lie she was willing to live for me. She was willing to walk back into the mouth of the wolf just to save her old father. Mark paused, his hand on the doorframe, a twisted sense of victory flickering across his face. He liked the begging. He liked the power. He turned back to look at me, a sneer curling his lip. "See, Arthur? She knows her place. She knows who she belongs to." He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers digging into the same bruises he had left earlier that night. Sarah flinched, her body recoiling in a natural, instinctive reaction to pain. That flinch was the spark that set the room on fire. Mark's expression shifted from triumph to rage in a heartbeat. He hated that she still feared him. He wanted her to love the fear. He raised his hand, the wrench glinting in the dim hallway light, and for a terrifying second, I thought it was the end. But the rage that had been simmering in my gut finally boiled over. I didn't care about the pain in my head or the weakness in my limbs. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing a heavy ceramic vase from the hallway table, a gift Sarah had given me years ago. I didn't hesitate. I swung it with everything I had left. The ceramic shattered against the side of his head, a spray of white dust and shards exploding into the air. He didn't fall, but he staggered, his grip on Sarah loosening just enough for her to break free and scramble toward the kitchen. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. Mark stood there, blood beginning to trickle from a cut on his temple, mixing with the white dust on his face. He looked at me, and for the first time, the man was completely gone. There was only the monster left. He didn't say a word. He just wiped the blood from his eye, his gaze locking onto mine with a predatory focus. I realized then that I hadn't stopped him. I had only stripped away his last bit of restraint. We were no longer in a house. We were in a cage. And as he began to walk toward me, the wrench gripped so tight his knuckles were white, I knew that the next few minutes would decide whether either of us would see the sunrise. The air in the hallway felt thick, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room, leaving only the metallic scent of blood and the bitter tang of adrenaline. Mark didn't rush me this time. He took a slow, agonizing step forward, his boots grinding the shards of the broken vase into the floorboards. The sound was like bone scraping on bone. He was watching me with a detached curiosity, his head tilted slightly to the side, while the blood from his temple began to soak into the collar of his white shirt. It was a terrifying sight. the image of a man who had completely surrendered to his own darkness. I could hear Sarah in the kitchen, the frantic clatter of a drawer being opened, the sound of her gasping for air. She was looking for a weapon, a knife, anything to defend the father who was currently standing between her and a nightmare. "You shouldn't have done that, Arthur," Mark whispered. His voice was no longer loud or booming. It was a soft, intimate hiss that felt like a razor blade against my skin. "I was going to be gentle with you. I was going to let you watch us leave. But now you've made it personal." He lunged. This time, there was no grace, only raw, unbridled violence. He swung the wrench in a wide, horizontal arc. I ducked, feeling the wind of the heavy tool whistle just inches above my scalp. The force of his swing carried him forward, and I used the momentum to shove him toward the kitchen door. I wasn't trying to fight him. I was trying to move the battlefield. I didn't want him cornering Sarah in a dead-end hallway. We spilled into the kitchen, the fluorescent light overhead flickering with a cold, sickly hum. Sarah was standing by the counter, her hands trembling as she gripped a heavy iron skillet. Her eyes were wide, darting between me and the man she had once called her husband. When Mark saw her, his expression changed again, that twisted, possessive love resurfacing like a drowned corpse. "Sarah, baby, put that down," he said, his voice dripping with a fake, poisonous sweetness. "Look what your father did to me. He's trying to keep us apart. He's the one causing all this trouble. Just come here and we can go. We can fix this." It was the ultimate lie, the final attempt to pull her back into the cycle of abuse. I stood between them, my breath coming in ragged, painful stabs. My ribs felt like they were being squeezed in a vice, and the world was starting to tilt. "Don't listen to him, Sarah," I managed to choke out. I looked at Mark, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt a profound, cold pity. "You're not going anywhere with her. You're going to jail, or you're going to the morgue. Those are your only choices now." The insult hit him harder than the vase did. His face contorted, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out like cords. He realized that his words no longer had power. The gaslighting, the charm, the manipulation, it had all failed. He was exposed, a small, violent man standing in the light of a kitchen he didn't belong in. With a roar of frustration, he threw the wrench. It wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at Sarah. She screamed and ducked, the heavy metal tool smashing into the microwave behind her, sending a shower of sparks and plastic flying. In that moment of distraction, I tackled him. I put every ounce of my remaining strength into a shoulder check that sent us both crashing into the kitchen table. The wood groaned and splintered under our combined weight. We hit the floor hard, and for a moment, the world went black. I could feel his hands on my throat, his thumbs digging into my windpipe. He was trying to choke the life out of me, his face hovering inches from mine, his teeth bared in a feral snarl. "Die, you old bastard," he hissed. I could feel my vision blurring at the edges, the bright kitchen lights fading into a dull, distant gray. I clawed at his wrists, but his grip was like iron. I looked past him, seeing Sarah moving toward us, the skillet raised high. But she was hesitating. The trauma of the years spent under his thumb was paralyzing her. She was terrified that if she hit him and he didn't go down, the retribution would be unthinkable. I tried to shout, to tell her to do it, but all that came out was a pathetic, gurgling sound. My lungs were burning, my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and then, just as the darkness was about to swallow me whole, a new sound cut through the chaos. It was the sound of a siren, distant but approaching fast. Someone in the neighborhood must have heard the screaming or the breaking glass. The blue and red lights began to dance against the kitchen window, casting a rhythmic, flickering glow over the room. Mark froze. The sound of the law was the one thing he couldn't manipulate or intimidate. His grip on my throat loosened just a fraction, his head turning toward the window like a deer caught in the headlights. In that split second of hesitation, I saw the shift. The predator realized he was about to become the prey. But as the sirens grew louder, I saw something else in his eyes, a desperate, cornered madness. He knew he was caught, and a man like Mark would rather burn the whole world down than face the consequences of his own actions. The sirens were a physical force now, a rising wail that seemed to vibrate the very floorboards we were pinned against. The rhythmic flashes of blue and red strobed through the kitchen windows, turning the room into a fragmented, nightmarish disco. Mark's hands were still around my throat, but the lethal pressure had turned into a frantic, shaking grip. He looked down at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the boy he must have been, terrified, caught, and realizing the game was up. But that flicker of humanity was instantly crushed by a renewed surge of spite. He didn't let go. Instead, he pulled me closer, using my body as a shield as he scrambled to his feet, dragging me up with him. "Tell them to go away!" he screamed, his voice cracking, leaning his mouth right against my ear. The smell of his sweat and the metallic tang of the blood on his face were overwhelming. "Tell them it's a mistake, Arthur! If you don't, I swear to God, I'll take you both out before they even get through the door." I was gasping for air, my throat feeling like it had been scraped with sandpaper. I looked over at Sarah. She was backed into the corner by the refrigerator, the iron skillet still clutched in her hands, her face ghostly white in the pulsing emergency lights. She looked like she was drifting away, her mind trying to escape to a place where this wasn't happening. The front door shook under the force of a heavy strike. "Police! Open up!" The command was booming, authoritative, and for a moment it felt like the voice of God entering our private hell. Mark panicked. He spun me around, his arms snaking around my neck in a chokehold, his other hand reaching into his pocket. I expected a knife, but instead, he pulled out a heavy, jagged piece of the ceramic vase he must have scooped up from the floor. He pressed the sharp edge against my jugular. The sting was immediate, a tiny trickle of warmth running down my neck. He wasn't thinking about escape anymore. He was thinking about leverage. He was thinking about how much pain he could still inflict before the end. "Get back, Sarah!" he roared as she took a tentative step forward. "Stay right there, or I'll open him up like a fish. I mean it." Sarah stopped, her breath coming in shallow, sobbing hitches. The skillet hit the floor with a heavy thud, her strength finally giving out. She sank to her knees, her hands covering her face, her body racking with silent, violent sobs. Seeing her like that, broken, defeated, watching her father being held hostage by the man she once loved, filled me with a cold, crystalline clarity. I realized that as long as I was a victim, she would stay a victim. I had to end this, not for my life, but for her soul. Outside, the police were moving to the perimeter. I could hear the muffled chatter of radios and the heavy footfalls of boots on the porch. "We have a visual through the side window," someone shouted. The light from a high-powered tactical flashlight cut through the kitchen, blinding us for a second. Mark recoiled, pulling me further into the shadows of the hallway. He was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving against my back. He was losing his grip on the situation, and a cornered man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. He started shouting at the windows, a stream of nonsensical threats and demands, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "I have a right to be here. She's my wife. You have no right to interfere," he screamed at the empty air. It was the delusion of the abuser, the belief that his marriage license was a license to kill. I felt the ceramic shard press deeper into my skin as he shook. I knew that if the police breached the door, his first instinct would be to slash. I had to move. I had to create a distraction. I looked at the kitchen counter, just inches away, where the teapot still sat. It was cold now, but the heavy ceramic pot was full of water. I didn't wait for a signal. I didn't wait for the police to act. I reached out, my fingers grazing the handle of the teapot, and I tipped it backward with everything I had. The water splashed over Mark's legs, and the heavy pot crashed onto his foot. He let out a yelp of surprise and pain, his grip on my neck loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all the space I needed. I slammed my elbow back into his ribs, hearing a satisfying crack, and twisted out of his hold. I fell to the floor, rolling away towards Sarah, as the front door finally gave way with a thunderous crash. The world exploded into motion. Get down now!" Shout after shout echoed through the house. Flashlights crisscrossed the dark, blinding and disorienting. I felt hands on my shoulders, pulling me back, while other figures moved past me toward the hallway where Mark stood, blinded and screaming. I reached for Sarah, pulling her into my lap, shielding her eyes from the violence of the arrest. I didn't want her to see the end. I didn't want her to have one more image of him burned into her brain. As the handcuffs clicked shut and the shouting began to die down, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, fearful silence of the night. It was the silence of a fever finally breaking. The transition from chaos to order was jarring. One moment, the house was a battlefield of shadows and screams. The next, it was flooded with the artificial, unforgiving light of tactical lanterns. Officers moved with a practiced, mechanical efficiency, their voices low and professional, a sharp contrast to the raw emotion that had just nearly torn the walls down. Mark was gone, led out in a swarm of dark uniforms, his face hidden, his once arrogant posture reduced to a frantic, stumbling mess. I sat on the back of an ambulance, a rough wool blanket draped over my shoulders that felt like sandpaper against my skin. A young paramedic was dabbing at the cut on my neck with an antiseptic wipe, the sting a grounding reminder that I was still alive. A few feet away, Sarah sat in the front seat of a patrol car. She looked small, so much smaller than the woman I had raised. She was wrapped in a similar blanket, staring out at the flashing lights with eyes that seemed to have seen the end of the world. She wasn't crying anymore. The tears had been replaced by a hollow, haunting emptiness. That's the thing about trauma. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just goes quiet. I watched as an officer knelt by the car door, holding a clipboard, speaking to her in that soft, careful tone reserved for the shattered. Every time she had to nod or answer a question, I felt a fresh wave of guilt. I had brought her into this world to protect her, and tonight, I had barely been enough. The lead detective, a man named Miller with tired eyes and a coat that smelled of old coffee, walked over to me. He didn't ask me how I was feeling. He knew the answer. He asked for the facts, the who, the what, and the when. As I spoke, the words felt heavy, like I was dropping stones into a deep well. Describing the affair, the bruises, the way Mark had broken into the back window, it all sounded like a script from a movie I never wanted to watch. But as I talked, I saw him writing it all down, turning our nightmare into a series of exhibits and evidence codes. It was the beginning of the long, bureaucratic process of justice. It felt cold and clinical, but it was the only shield we had left. "He's going to be processed for aggravated assault and residential burglary," Miller said, snapping his notebook shut. "With the history of domestic calls at their old address and the injuries to your daughter, he won't be getting out on a signature bond. But Arthur, you need to understand, men like this, they don't just go away. You need to get her a protective order first thing in the morning, and you might want to look into a security system that doesn't rely on ivy-covered windows." I nodded, though his words felt like they were coming from a great distance. My mind was already moving toward the logistics of survival. How would I keep her safe when the bruises faded? How would I help her sleep when every creak of this house would now sound like a boot on glass? The paramedic finished with my neck and told me I should go to the hospital for a chest x-ray, just to be sure about my ribs. I refused. I wasn't leaving Sarah. I walked over to the patrol car, and the officer stepped aside to let me in. The moment I sat down next to her, she leaned her head on my shoulder. She didn't say anything, but the way she clung to my arm told me everything. The house behind us, the home I had lived in for 30 years, now felt like a crime scene. Yellow tape was being strung across the porch, flickering in the blue light. The sanctuary had been violated. We stayed there for a long time, watching the forensic team take photos of the shattered vase and the dented microwave. It was surreal to see the mundane objects of my life turned into evidence of a crime. That vase had been a birthday gift. That microwave had warmed up 1,000 Sunday dinners. Now, they were symbols of a man's descent into madness. Sarah finally spoke, her voice so low I almost missed it. "He told me no one would believe me," she whispered. "He said if I ever left, he'd make sure I had nothing left to go to." I pulled her closer, the anger in my chest flaring up again, but I kept my voice steady. I told her that he was wrong. I told her that she had everything. She had her life, she had her truth, and she had a father who would burn the world down before letting him near her again. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of gray and purple, the police began to clear out. The spectacle was over for the neighbors, who were peeking through their curtains, but for us, the real work was just beginning. We were exhausted, battered, and broken in ways that wouldn't show up on an X-ray. But as I led her back into the house, Stepping over the threshold that had been a battleground only hours before, I felt a grim sense of resolve. The night was over. The monster was in a cage. Now, we just had to learn how to live in the light again. The following morning didn't bring the relief I had hoped for. The sun rose with a blinding, indifferent brightness that made the damage to the house look even more garish. Every shard of glass we missed with the broom caught the light, sparkling like tiny diamonds of malice. Sarah was asleep on the sofa, her rest fitful and punctuated by sudden, sharp gasps of air. I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of legal documents that the victim's advocate had dropped off at dawn. It was a mountain of paper: restraining orders, temporary injunctions, statements of fact. They call it a paper shield, a thin layer of bureaucracy designed to keep a predator at bay. But as I stared at Mark's name typed in cold black ink, the paper felt as flimsy as tissue. The phone rang incessantly. It was Mark's family, his lawyers, and people we hadn't spoken to in years, all circling like vultures. His mother called, her voice high and hysterical, accusing Sarah of destroying a good man's career over a private disagreement. I listened for exactly 10 seconds before hanging up. The level of delusion was staggering. To them, the bruises on my daughter's face were just an inconvenience, a smudge on the reputation of their golden boy. It made me realize that Mark didn't become a monster in a vacuum. He was raised in a garden of excuses. He had been taught his whole life that his needs outweighed the safety of others, and that reality was something he could bend to his will. By noon, we were at the courthouse. The halls were cold, smelling of floor wax and old wood. Sarah walked beside me, her head down, her oversized sunglasses hiding the worst of the swelling. We were there for the emergency protective order hearing. It was supposed to be a formality, but in the sterile environment of a courtroom, everything feels like an interrogation. We sat in the back row, waiting for our case to be called. When the bailiff finally announced the names, Sarah's hand gripped mine so hard I thought my knuckles might crack. We walked to the front, and there, sitting at the defense table, was Mark's lawyer. A man in a sharp gray suit who looked at us with the detached boredom of a man waiting for a bus. Mark wasn't there. He was still being held at the county jail, but his presence filled the room like a suffocating fog. His lawyer stood up and began to weave a narrative that made my skin crawl. He spoke of marital stress, mutual provocation, and unfortunate misunderstandings. He tried to paint Sarah as the aggressor, suggesting that she had been the one to initiate the physical contact, and that Mark was simply trying to restrain her for her own safety. It was a masterclass in professional gaslighting. I felt the heat rising in my neck, the same white-hot rage from the night before threatening to spill over. I wanted to scream. I wanted to show the judge the photos of the shattered back window and the marks on my daughter's throat. But then, Sarah did something that surprised me. She stood up. She didn't wait for the lawyer to finish his performance. She took off her sunglasses, revealing the deep, ugly purple of her eye to the entire room. The lawyer stopped mid-sentence. The judge, an older woman with a face like carved granite, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Sarah. Sarah didn't yell. She didn't cry. She spoke in a voice that was quiet, steady, and utterly unbreakable. She told the court exactly what happened, from the first discovery of the affair to the moment the wrench hit the microwave. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The truth has a weight that lies can never replicate. "I am not a misunderstanding," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "I am a woman who was hunted in my own home. My father is a man who had to fight for his life to save mine. This paper isn't for him, it's for me. Because if you don't sign it, you are telling him that he was right. You are telling him that I am his property." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time since that knock at 1 a.m., the power dynamic shifted. The lawyer sat down, his papers suddenly very interesting to him. The judge didn't even hesitate. She signed the order with a flourish of her pen that sounded like a final judgment. As we walked out of the courthouse, the air felt a little thinner, a little easier to breathe. We had the paper. We had the legal declaration of his guilt. But as we reached the car, I saw a familiar black SUV parked across the street. It wasn't Mark, he was still behind bars, but it was his brother, sitting behind the wheel, watching us with a cold, steady gaze. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The legal battle was just the beginning. Mark might be in a cell, but his influence, his family, and his obsession were still very much alive. We weren't just fighting a man, we were fighting a legacy of control. I realized then that our safety was a fragile thing, a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. The protective order was supposed to be a wall, but it felt more like a window. Everyone could see in, and we were always looking out. For the next 3 days, the house became a fortress. I had the back window professionally boarded and then replaced with reinforced glass. I installed cameras at every corner, their little blue eyes glowing in the dark, recording the emptiness of the street. But no amount of technology could scrub the memory of the violence from the air. Every time the floorboard creaked, Sarah would drop whatever she was holding. Every time a car slowed down in front of the house, we both stopped breathing. We were living in the aftermath, but the aftermath felt like a slow-motion version of the event itself. Then, the digital psychological warfare began. It started with the messages, not from Mark, he knew better than to violate the order directly, but from anonymous accounts, burner profiles with no faces and no names. They flooded Sarah's phone with images of them together from happier times, photos of their wedding day, photos of their first house. Each one was a jagged reminder of the life he had stolen from her. It was a sophisticated form of torture, a way of saying, "I am still in your head." Then came the gifts. A bouquet of lilies, Sarah's favorite, left on the porch in the middle of the night. No card, no name, just the silent, fragrant threat that someone had been there, standing on our property while we slept. I called Detective Miller, but his response was a frustrated sigh. "Arthur, without a direct link to Mark, there's not much we can do. Lilies aren't a crime. A photo of a wedding isn't an assault. He's playing the game. He's using his friends or his family to do the walking for him." It was the ultimate loophole. Mark was sitting in a cell, yet he was still pulling the strings of our sanity. I realized then that his goal wasn't just to hurt Sarah, it was to exhaust her. He wanted to wear her down until she felt like the only way to make the haunting stop was to go back to him, to plead for mercy, to accept his version of the truth just to have a moment of peace. The breaking point came on Thursday night. Sarah was in the shower, the sound of the running water the only noise in the house. I was sitting in the living room, watching the monitors of the security cameras, when I saw a flicker of movement on the screen. A figure was standing at the edge of the woods that bordered the back of my property. They weren't moving, they were just standing there, watching the house. I felt a cold chill wash over me. I grabbed my flashlight and headed for the back door, but then I heard Sarah scream from the bathroom. I didn't think. I kicked the bathroom door open, expecting to see Mark or one of his cronies. But Sarah was standing in the middle of the room, wrapped in a towel, staring at the steamed-up mirror. Someone had written a single word in the condensation from the outside before the window had been fully secured. One word, written in a shaking, familiar hand. Reckoning. The fear in her eyes was different this time. It wasn't the frantic terror of the night he attacked her. It was the hollow, soul-crushing realization that there was no such thing as safe. I held her as she wept, her body shaking with a cold that no blanket could fix. I looked at that word on the glass, the letters beginning to drip as the steam turned back to water. It was a promise. Mark didn't want a divorce. He didn't even want a reconciliation anymore. He wanted a total collapse. He wanted to prove that even from behind bars, he owned the air we breathed. I realized that as long as we stayed in this house, as long as we played by the rules of the paper shield, we were just waiting for him to find a way through. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with a kitchen knife on the table next to me, watching the shadows dance on the wall. I realized that the legal system was designed for people who followed the rules, but we were dealing with a man who viewed rules as challenges. My mind began to turn toward a darker place. If the law couldn't protect her, if the cameras couldn't keep him out, then the responsibility fell solely on me. I looked at my hands, the hands of a father who had spent a lifetime building things, and I realized they were capable of tearing things down too. The reckoning he promised was coming, but I decided right then that it wouldn't be his, it would be mine. The reckoning Mark promised never came the way he intended. He expected us to wait in that house like ghosts, jumping at every shadow until we eventually broke. He expected me to be a victim of my own fear. But as the clock ticked toward 4 a.m., I stopped being afraid. There is a specific kind of calm that settles over a man when he realizes that he has nothing left to lose except the person he loves most. I didn't pick up a weapon to go hunting in the woods. Instead, I picked up a suitcase. I woke Sarah up before the sun was even a thought on the horizon. I didn't ask her if she was ready. I simply told her we were leaving. We didn't pack the furniture, the memories, or the things that tied us to that place. We packed the essentials: clothes, documents, and the few photographs that didn't have Mark's face in them. By 5 a.m., the car was loaded. I stood in the middle of the living room, the place where Sarah had collapsed into my arms just a few nights before. I looked at the boarded-up window and the security cameras that had become our eyes. I reached up and unplugged the system. If Mark wanted to watch us through his proxies, he would find only a dark house and an empty driveway. We drove for hours, heading north toward the coast where my brother had a small cabin tucked away in a town that didn't know our names. As the miles stretched out between us and the city, I watched Sarah in the passenger seat. For the first 50 miles, she kept checking the side mirrors, her hands clenched in her lap. But as the landscape shifted from suburban sprawl to the open, rugged beauty of the pines, her shoulders finally began to drop. The silence in the car wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the house. It was the quiet of a long overdue rest. 3 weeks later, I received a call from Detective Miller. Mark had been denied bail again, but more importantly, the evidence of witness tampering, the lilies, the messages, the word in the steam, had been traced back to his brother. The proxies were now facing their own legal nightmares. The house back home was on the market, and the realtor told me there were already offers. We were cutting the anchors, one by one. The man who thought he could own us from a jail cell was finding out that his world was shrinking, while ours was finally expanding. One evening, Sarah and I walked down to the shoreline. The air was cold and smelled of salt and wet cedar. Her bruises had faded to a faint, yellowish blur, almost invisible under the soft light of the setting sun. She looked out at the horizon, where the gray water met the gray sky, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. It wasn't a big, joyful grin. It was a small, tired smile of someone who had survived a storm and was surprised to find they could still breathe. "I thought I would never feel safe again, Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper over the sound of the waves. I looked at her, my daughter who had been broken and put back together with a strength she never should have had to find. I told her that safety isn't a place you live in, it's the people who refuse to let go of you. I told her that Mark didn't take her life, he just took a version of it that was never good enough for her anyway. The story that started at 1 a.m. with a frantic knock and a daughter falling into my arms didn't end with a tragedy, it ended with a beginning. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting a long golden path across the water, I realized that the reckoning had happened after all. It was the moment Sarah chose to live. It was the moment I chose to lead her out of the dark. We walked back toward the cabin, leaving our footprints in the sand, knowing that the tide would soon wash them away, just like it would wash away the memory of the man who tried to break us. We were home, not because of the walls around us, but because the monster was gone, and the morning had finally, truly arrived.